Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Thank all of you for being here today to join us on this event on part of our ongoing series on refugees. My name is Paolo von Schirach. I serve as president of the Global Policy Institute here in Washington, D.C., and also as a professor of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University. We are both organizations are in downtown Washington, D.C. For those who don't know about us, we're very close to the White House, Fayette Park, and that's our physical location. So today, we have the privilege of having with us an expert in many ways, and perhaps including ways that he doesn't particularly enjoy, to be part of this drama, this tragedy of Afghan refugees. We have with us a diplomat, Sayer Daudzai, who has served his country, Afghanistan. Of course, when Afghanistan was an Islamic republic, but it was a republic, democratic, with elections, with parties, freedom of expression, multimedia outlets, where women could go to school, could work, could be employed, could be teachers, could be do all kinds of things. Now, as we know, it's a completely different story. And it's kind of garbled and a little complicated. We know that the American exit from Afghanistan was very tragically, poorly managed. And with the whole world seeing chaos and disorganization, we still remember people hanging from wheels or whatever of airplanes at the Kabul airport and more. But let me not go ahead of us at this time. So I would like our guest served, as I said, as a diplomat for his country in multiple important posts, particularly the last one. He'll elaborate on that with the United Arab Emirates, where he could perform extremely important functions in assisting refugees, as it were, who are trying to not only escape from Afghanistan, but also find a new life in other places. So welcome to you, Sayer. Tell us tell everybody a little bit about yourself, and then we can start getting onto the subject, particularly trying to figure out a little bit of a chronology of salient milestones that led us to where, unfortunately, we are today.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Hello to you. Hello to our audience who are joining us online and in present here. A little bit about myself. So I've been a lifelong refugee myself on multiple occasions. In my early years, I was born in Afghanistan, but we had to move to Pakistan at a very early age due to the collapse of Dr. Najib's communist government, and a large wave of refugees left to Pakistan. We were one of them. In the 1990s, we had the privilege, because my father was studying in the United Kingdom, so we moved there, and we lived there for a couple of years. But our love for our country was so strong that as soon as he finished his studies, we decided to come back to Pakistan, because we thought we are right next door to Afghanistan, and as soon as the situation allows it, we could live and resume our lives in Afghanistan. So, because of this refugee experience, I had the privilege of living in many countries. The refugee crisis of Afghanistan, one of the most acute in the world. To explore it, we have to look at the different waves of refugees that we've experienced. The first wave was in 1973, when there was an internal coup within the royal family of Afghanistan, and then some people within Afghanistan sensed that instability might be on its way, because there was a hand of the Soviet Union in that coup, and people felt that this is not going in the right direction. Then the second wave of refugees was right around the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan,
which was in
1979.
79.
Yeah, and this was a much larger wave, and it continued throughout the 1980s. We are a product of that wave as well. According to some estimates, almost half of Afghanistan's population migrated to Pakistan, Iran, and beyond at that time. The war was very brutal, especially in rural Afghanistan. It was probably one of the very few cases where extreme forms of weapons were used, such as toy bombs, throwing toys from the sky so that you could mislead children to. It was a devastating war, and that's why it's understandable why such a large number of Afghans had to migrate. Then a third wave was right after the collapse of the communist government due to the infighting in the 1990s. And then that wave of refugees continued until the early 2000s. Now, in 2001, many Afghans, in the millions, returned back to Afghanistan when the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was established. A democratic experiment started in Afghanistan. And we saw a return not only from Pakistan, Iran, and neighboring countries, but from the United States, from the United Kingdom, which shows that love that Afghans have for their homeland, it doesn't die away when they become refugees. That longing to return to the country is always there. But unfortunately, in 2006 onwards, the security situation in Afghanistan deteriorated again, and new waves of refugees started leaving in the 2010s, which reached a large scale in that period between 2014 to 2017. That is when, Paulo, I was appointed as a vice consul in our consulate general in Istanbul, which was at the center of this wave of migration from Afghanistan to Europe, the illegal wave. It was my first experience working on illegal migration, and it was a very interesting experience. I'll shed some light on it. One part of my job was analysis, to look at the root causes of the migration at the time, and one of the issues that we were faced with was the utilization of porous borders. So one of the tragedies of the Middle East and South Asia is that national borders don't necessarily align with ethnic borders. And this creates ground for smuggling of all sorts. And human trafficking is an important aspect of that. So often we would see that refugees or migrants who are coming from Afghanistan to Europe would use Nimroz province in southwest of Afghanistan, which has a prominent presence of our Baloch ethnicity, also are present on the other side in Iran. And the porous border allowed organized criminals to smuggle people. Similarly, between Iran and Turkey, we had the Kurdistan region, which was a primary route for human traffickers to traffic people because of the porousness of the border there. I also realized during that term that there is when you have one flow of an illegal activity, it opens the gates for other forms of illegal activity to take place as well. As we have a saying in Afghanistan, when water flows a direction once, it will definitely flow again. And so with human trafficking that we were investigating through Istanbul, through Turkey, we realized a flow of narcotics through the same channels. We realized the flow of illicit financial flows as well. And that significantly complicated my mission and the mission of our
if I may ask it, just because people obviously are interested in what happened to all these people. Obviously, these are not very auspicious circumstances to leave your country. As you say, porous borders, being trafficked, paying gangs that move you from here to there. We know some of this, sort of got some similarities I can think of our border with Mexico and how all this is managed by criminal gangs, etc. But so the people who manage you, first of all, what kind of a flow are we talking about when you were there in your observation post in Istanbul? What are we talking about? How many people managed to take advantage of these escape routes, and where did they end up? I mean, I know it's difficult to say, but they end up in Europe, they end up in Turkey or somewhere else. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, the number was definitely in the hundreds of thousands per year.
Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands. And there was
per
always, year. Per year, there was always a pent-up supply of and it's not the right word, but of people that was in Turkey, the hundreds of thousands, and then slowly they would flow through two directions to Europe. One was by sea, often to the Greek islands through boats, and the other was through land routes to Bulgaria and then to the Balkans and to Europe. The primary objective.
So these people helped to settle, I don't know, in Germany or in
Primarily.
Sweden, or what was the idea?
Primarily Germany, because Germany's policies were relatively more liberal towards migrants at the time. This was something that we realized when illegal migrants from Afghanistan were caught in the Balkan countries. They would often declare to the authorities that I do not intend to stay here. If you arrest me, I am your problem. If you just let me go,
I'm just going to go north.
So, and this was a dilemma for many of these countries, because they didn't want, these Balkan countries did not want the refugees to come in. But once they came in,
they want them out.
They want them out. They instead of dealing with them and incarcerating them. So this was an issue. Now, there were a lot of horrors associated with this flow as well, because it's illicit. It's not official. It's not done in coordination with authorities. So one of the tragedies that I often witnessed was, because I said before, that these smuggling routes are multifaceted, the same smugglers that were smuggling people are also often smuggling funds for them. So someone who wants to go to Europe would pay a human trafficker to get him to Europe, but then would give him additional funds, their savings, and tell them to give it to me when I reach you. Now, sometimes we realize that the human traffickers had an incentive for the boats to sink, so that nobody could come and claim the money.
So they would get to keep it.
They get to keep it. And that's why we had many instances where a boat would sink. We would interview the nationals, at least Afghan nationals that we were engaged with, and they would say that the boat was sunk on purpose.
May I ask you, thank you for this. I mean, in this context, as this phenomenon was underway, and this again, we still have let's call it the legitimate Afghani government in Kabul. First was Karzai, then So what was the international community doing? Was anybody paying attention? Were the UN agencies involved? Was the Red Cross involved? Or people kind of pretended, this wasn't happening and looked the other way? What?
That's an important point. And it was part of the analysis that we were conducting at that time. So there were three primary reasons why there was this uptick in illegal migration from 2014 onwards. One was, that is around the time when the international community, the NATO forces, handed over security responsibility to the Afghans. And in essence, they went out of active battlefield posture and went to resolute support posture. And that by default meant that some of additional geography fell in the hands of the Taliban, and that triggered many people from rural parts of Afghanistan to leave Afghanistan. Second reason was with the reduction, because if you remember, in the early 2010s, President Obama's policy of surge, they moved in tens of thousands of additional forces, that also caused an economic boom in Afghanistan, because a lot of funds were coming in. This led to procurement sectors development and GDP growth. But around 2014, when the security responsibility was handed over to Afghan, U.S. troops were rapidly withdrawn from Afghanistan.
Less money.
This meant unemployment. This meant economic shock to Afghanistan. Then the third reason is, this is right around the time when ISKP appeared in Afghanistan. They appeared in eastern Afghanistan, northeastern Afghanistan, and they were not only targeting Afghans, government-affiliated Afghans, but also Taliban. So many people of various social associations had to migrate out of Afghanistan at that time.
Okay. Can we let's fast forward to the more recent tragic events that you are particularly keen in remembering? I guess it's a sad situation. So I guess it became clear during the Trump administration that everybody was looking for the exit, right? It wasn't unmistakable that this was the objective of the Trump. I mean, the drawdown, as you said, started before, but then it became more acute at the time of the Trump administration, you had those negotiations with the Taliban directly, without the government, strangely enough. But in Doha, Khalilzad, Afghan-born senior American diplomat, conducted all this, and this led to a drawdown, right? With efforts to find some kind of a political agreement with the Taliban, saying, okay, you can do this, but no terrorists or whatever. But people, I guess, started seeing the writing on the wall, and probably that led to more refugees. Am I correct?
Yeah.
As this situation had not precipitated yet, but it was kind of looking increasingly bleak. So more people were. And at that point, you were still in Istanbul, or you were already in the UAE at that point?
I was in the UAE at that time, serving as a deputy ambassador. As we became closer and closer to the Doha agreement, which was signed in February 2020, we saw an additional spike in refugees, mostly migrants, I would say, were the illegal migrants who were going through three channels primarily. One through the land route to Iran, Turkey, and then Europe. Other was through the Central Asian route, going to Russia and then to Europe. And the third route was through Indonesia and then to Australia. They all three routes were spiked up at that time. But up until the point when I served in Istanbul, my experience was primarily with illegal migration. And I would like to add one more point, that in my entire service in Istanbul, I only met one individual who did not regret taking the journey. Every other one that I met said, we regret taking this journey, but we have already given everything we have, and there's no way.
We're stuck. Yeah. There's no way of return.
So that was the illegal migration. My experience with legal migration, refugees, started in 2021, when the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan collapsed.
Let me just, sorry, if I can interrupt you here. And again, this is kind of the wisdom of the day after. Did anybody see that? Because no, the general impression here is that this was a gigantic intelligence failure in America, at least from an American perspective, that everybody said, yeah, I mean, things look dicey. The Taliban is making inroads. They're taking over some rural areas, but no worries, because the armed forces of Afghanistan, we Americans paid for and trained, the army, the police, etc. They're going to hold the terrain. So, worst case scenario, after we leave, at least 6 months of how can I say, control. Maybe later, we don't know. But was that your impression as well, or you as a diplomat say, oh my God, this is really looking bad, and God help us? I mean, what was your take at the time?
In retrospect,
being away from the country,
But my impression was the same, that the armed forces will hold up for at least 6 months, because that was the analysis that we were given for years before we arrived in that year, 2021. Our president, former President Rouhani, had mentioned many times in interviews before, we have the capability to hold for 6 months.
Even without the Americans.
Even without the Americans.
And
we were all surprised. We were all surprised in 2021. But another component of that was the rapidity of U.S. forces withdrawal was also unanticipated by Afghans. They withdrew much quicker than we expected. We understand the military doctrine behind that. If you look at all foreign interventions in Afghanistan going more than 100 years, the going in part is easy. The getting out part is more difficult. Vast majority of casualties have been when armies are withdrawing from Afghanistan. We have the history, I think it was the first Anglo-Afghan War, 15,000 strong army was withdrawing Afghanistan, but only one individual made it out alive. So there was probably analysis on the military side in the US that if we are to withdraw, it's best to do it as quickly as we can. And that could have contributed to that realignment, the 6-month estimate of the Afghan forces as well.
Understood. But so the whole thing, okay, we don't need to reconstruct all the events. So 2021, it's a new administration. Biden, who clearly indicates that it's time to go. That was not a mistake. The question was the timeline. when are we going to do this? Oddly enough, they chose September 11th, which is really kind of as everybody knows, September 11th, what happened. And that clearly we know that the roots, not everything, but the roots of that terror plot was hatched in Afghanistan, in the training camps of Al Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. This is like ancient history now. But so that became the plan. And I imagine that then, please correct me if I'm wrong, that many of the people who had been working with the NATO forces, particularly with the Americans, started getting a little anxious, saying, oh my God, what's going to happen to us, right? Can you elaborate on that? How that, and what was the perception you were getting as a diplomat, obviously posted in the Gulf, about this new phenomenon of concern of tens of thousands, I don't know what the real numbers are, but probably tens of thousands of people and their families who had been working with the Americans, as whatever, translators, facilitators. I just met somebody not too long ago, and I said, where are you from? I'm from Afghanistan. What were you doing in Afghanistan? Well, I was working at the American embassy. Doing what? Well, I was a maintenance person, nothing special. But, you work with the Americans, you're marked, right? And then I don't know how he managed to escape, but I'm sure like him, thousands and thousands, right? Can you elaborate on what was your perception, since you were not in the country, about how this was going to evolve in the spring and then early summer of 2021?
In that difficult year for us, around August 2021, as I said earlier, I was serving as deputy ambassador, and we had the unfortunate situation that our embassy had to play a primary role in part of that evacuations. I remember very well, just a few days after the collapse of our government, we were forced to accommodate, because of the lack of options, some refugees to come to the UAE. We're very thankful to the UAE government, who facilitated location for the refugees. The US State Department, we're very thankful to them. They immediately moved the US Embassy in Abu Dhabi. And what was supposed to be an evacuation of a few hundred individuals ended up becoming a refugee camp, or the Emiratis don't recognize it as that because they don't recognize refugees, but a camp where we had processed 17,500 individuals.
17,000.
17,500. And it was a trilateral program run by our embassy, US Embassy in Abu Dhabi, and the UAE authorities. And just a couple of weeks after the collapse of our government and the establishment of the camp, I had to take over the embassy as the charge d'affaires, the acting ambassador, and I managed the affairs of that camp for more than 2 years.
2 years. So you saw all sorts of people coming through.
I saw the dysfunctional nature of the refugee system in the Western world, and I will comment on that as well. So one of the primary issues that we face, at least in the Emirates humanitarian city, but we were monitoring the broader evacuation program, was there were a lot of individuals who were very high risk and were actively sought after by the Taliban. But the problem was the extraction point was the Kabul airport. The perimeter security was provided by the Taliban. So any individual who is a high-risk individual and needs to get out of the country,
needed to go
identify himself or herself to the Taliban, get permission to cross the checkpoint and go to the airport. So it's no surprise that the vast majority of the high-risk individuals didn't make it, didn't even attempt.
Because they knew they would be caught.
They knew they would be caught.
Because at the beginning, please correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I recall, the Taliban said, "Oh, it's fine. We're going to help people. If people want to go, we don't need them. Right? We don't want people who are not loyal to us. If they want to go away, be my guest." But that wasn't really the way it worked.
No.
So there were reprisals, targeting, and all that stuff.
There were. So that was the first dysfunction in the evacuation. The second one was after the airport saga was completed, a much more longer and sustained evacuation operation was started. Many of the people that came to our Emirates humanitarian city, where we processed 17,500 individuals, were part of that sustained operation. Once again, the problem there, Paulo, was, as an example, the US refugee system. To be processed as a refugee, or to even start processing your case as a refugee, the first step is you have to move out of Afghanistan, go to a third country, and then you contact the US relevant authorities. And now, to get out of Afghanistan, if you're stuck in Afghanistan, you need to be a refugee, you need to get out to a neighboring country. What do you need? You need a passport. After August 15, 2021, who is issuing passports? It is the Taliban's authority. So once again, you'll have to go and apply for a passport with the Taliban to get out, and you will identify yourself. And this is at a time when the biometric data of our armed forces is already in the hands of the Taliban. All they have to do is run your fingerprints and your profile comes out. And that's a long story,
So
but
that couldn't be done.
It couldn't be done. So, and you know, the dysfunction here, Pablo, is you would not face all these problems if you were an illegal migrant. If you're an illegal migrant, all you have to do is find a human trafficker. You don't need a passport. You don't need documents. You pay, and he or she will take you within a couple of months to your destination in Europe. These are problems that you face if you're a legal migrant, if you're an actual refugee. So this was a tragic situation that we faced. We saw this in the Emirates humanitarian. Significant number of individuals that came there didn't have a case to go to the United States or Canada and Australia. They simply were able to get into the airport because they were able to convince the outer perimeter of the Taliban to allow them to go to the airport. And they were able to board planes and disembark. And it was not only in the UAE. We had stations in Qatar, in Albania, in Kosovo, and the vast majority of people taken there were people who were authorized to go into the airport at the time. Now, another issue that we faced right after, and while we were working in the embassy there, I had a great team working with me, talk about that as well, was the misuse of documentation of Afghans that sustained after 2021. So one of the first issues was that I was contacted by multiple countries, regional and Western, about reports that they were receiving that many individuals who are not of actual Afghan origin have acquired Afghan passports after 2021. This complicated the refugee process even more because now you have to do additional security check. And the issue that was there, if I narrow down on it, in the 1980s, a lot of Arab volunteers and foreign volunteers came to Afghanistan to fight the jihad against the Soviet Union. Some of them later became Al-Qaeda, and many of them are no longer alive, but they've left behind families. Many of them married local women, Afghans, and now they have.
This was the jihadists who were the Mujahideen, part of the broad Mujahideen force that was fighting against the
Soviets, and later became Al-Qaeda and a wide variety of.
So huge confusion.
Huge confusion, and now they have children in Afghanistan who look like me as an Afghan, who talk like me, will not even have an accent.
But they're not really Afghans.
Now, the problem is, for elements within the Taliban, they would consider them more Afghans than the people that they were fighting against, because these individuals were probably fighting in the ranks of the Taliban in the last 20 years. So in their definition, they are probably more Afghan than many other Afghans. So this was a problem. Another problem that I soon after was faced with in the UAE was that many similar individuals started attempting to fly to African countries, because the visa regime was much more easier in many African countries for Afghan nationals. When I delved deeper into it, in coordination with many of our Western allies and other stakeholders, we realized that they were trying to get to Africa and then by the same illegal routes to Europe.
Go to Europe.
Go to Europe.
Awesome.
And these are not Afghans. These are high-risk individuals. Our analysis at the time was, and this could be incorrect, but this is the analysis we had at the time, that there were a lot of foreign jihadists in Afghanistan. And they were welcome in Afghanistan by some elements of the Taliban and not so welcome by other elements. The elements that didn't welcome them, remember 2001, that their entire government was collapsed because they hosted Osama bin Laden. And they had the commitments in the Doha Agreement that they will not host foreign jihadis that came to cause turbulence inside. And the US government has been very clear that they intend to hold the Taliban to their commitments and will act if necessary. So there are elements, at that time we had the analysis that within the Taliban who did not want these individuals, but there are others who do. Now, the problem was those who didn't want them there could not force them out of Afghanistan, because that would create internal disagreements within the Taliban's authority. This would create an issue of cohesion. So what were they trying to do? Incentivize them to voluntarily leave Afghanistan. What do you need? You need a passport? Sure, we'll get you one. You need other documents? We'll get you. There's no more jihad in Afghanistan, but there is outside. So there's the exit route. So this is a problem that complicated this process further.
May I, sorry, because obviously there's plenty of important details here. Can you give us a kind of a, I don't know if it's possible, an approximate number? If you consider all the people who were at risk for various reasons, and I'm focusing now, but I'm sure there are other categories, on everybody who worked with the NATO forces, or in any event, engaged with the Westerners, with the Americans, with all the others. What kind of numbers are we talking about? The people who once the Taliban took over Kabul in August, right? Of 2021. What are we talking about? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? What the people who were at risk and had to find a way out as soon as possible? What kind of approximate number? If we talk them and their families, of course.
It's a difficult number to estimate because we don't have the right data in front of us. But I would assume it would be in the hundreds of thousands. I mean, the U.S. evacuated almost 100,000 in the operations, and then they accept that there are many more that are left behind. The same with the British, the Canadians. But there is, depending on the category, this estimate can change. If it's strictly a measurement of how many U.S. allies are left behind, then we're talking about SIV case holders. These are people who assisted the U.S. mission directly. Of course, that number is in the tens of thousands. But then when you talk about refugees, people who indirectly helped the U.S. mission, or by default, due to the risk that they face, they qualify as refugees, then the number is in the hundreds of thousands, could even touch million. Could be more than that.
Let me ask you also, once the airport escape hatch was closed and people who could no longer go to the airport, even though through the Taliban checkpoints, and board an airplane to Doha or Abu Dhabi or whatever, then people went through other, obviously, even overland, you say via Iran, Balochistan, then you go Pakistan, the porous border, especially in the south, everybody's Pashto.
Yeah.
People maybe don't focus on that.
Yeah.
That they're Pashtus, but basically the same people.
Easy to.
From both sides of the border. This is an arbitrary border, which is not an ethnic border. So people, if you're Pashto, speak the same language, you can, move to Pakistan and from there figure it out. So this is where were the primary escape routes, as far as you know, after the early period of evacuation via the airport was no longer available.
Yeah. Well, now, surprisingly, there were arrangements that I'm not privy to between the U.S. government and the authorities in Kabul, which did allow flights to sporadically take place, sometimes from not from Kabul or from other airports because of disagreements within the Taliban. So one group within them could guarantee the evacuation of a group, but they couldn't convince another group. So they would say, you'll have to fly out of that airport where I have firmer control. So those kind of case-by-case arrangements were there, but at some point, I'm aware that the safest route for refugees was to even illegally go to Pakistan or Iran, and then be legally evacuated to a Western country.
Okay, and Iran cooperated in this?
Iran did not cooperate in this, but they did not prohibit this as well, from what I understand. But the problem with Iran was that many Western countries do not have embassies there. And
that's right. Certainly the U.S. does not.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah. But the other issue in this regard is that, once again, I would like to make a comparison of legal versus illegal migration and refugee. What I learned during this time is that the system is rigged in favor of illegal migration. The incentive is always there for the illegal migrants, not for legal. And I'll give you an example. If you're a legal migrant, as I mentioned earlier, you have the passport issue, you have the airport issue. Beyond that, you made it to Pakistan. Now you're there, and you've contacted, let's take an example of the US, and the process started. It is not unusual for the process to take 2 to 3 years.
In the meantime, you got to live there, you got to pay for your expenses, you don't have any money, and then it becomes a real problem.
An illegal refugee does not have to wait. Within 2 months, they will be in the United Kingdom, in Germany, wherever you want. But a legal migrant will have to wait 2 to 3 years in Iran and Pakistan. Now, in these 3 years, as you mentioned, you could become destitute, which will force you to go back to your country at huge risk to your own security. You could be deported or extradited from these countries. And I'm not just talking theoreticals here. These are things that have happened with Afghans in the last 2 to 3 years, and there is documentation of this. All you have to do is, one of the famous Afghan journalists, Bilal Sarwari, just look at his Twitter feed. He constantly reports these high-risk Afghans who are in Iran or Pakistan ended up being extradited and then killed. And
extradited back to Afghanistan
from these neighboring countries. And in the early, at least in the first year, there were multiple reports of them being assassinated in these countries. Those that were very high value targets, they could be reached in Pakistan and Iran. I mean, the Taliban had bases there before they came to Afghanistan, and they still have reached there. So you have to deal with destitution. If you're a legal refugee, you have to deal with deportation and extradition risk. Tens of thousands of Afghans were forcefully deported in 2023 and 2022 from Pakistan. And it is on record that many of them were US P1, P2, and SID holders in process. And you face the risk of being killed in these countries. None of these risks are faced by illegal migrants. Now the irony here, Paulo, is as a legal refugee, one of the reasons why you have to wait 2 to 3 years is because the line is being cut by illegal. When you have the illegal migrants that go in tens of thousands to, not only from Afghanistan, from different countries, to the US, to UK, to Germany, the resources are engaged as well. And there are not enough resources to process the legal cases. And the problem is, if you're sitting in the US, if an illegal migrant comes here, that is your priority, even if the migrant is illegal, because they're already on your side.
You have to take care of them.
You have to take care of them immediately. Whereas a legal refugee who's waiting for 2 to 3 years somewhere is not an immediate issue for you, because you don't see the suffering, you don't feel the suffering. They're not on your land. So it's like, unfortunately, if you an example would be, if you're very ill and you're in an emergency room and you're waiting for the doctor, but other people who are not as ill as you keep cutting the line, and your line keeps getting longer. That is how these refugees would feel.
May I ask you, I don't know if this is probably not an easy question to answer, but now it's been many years, right? Do you have a sense of what happened? And I know everybody went everywhere, scattered, some in the US, some in Europe, some in Pakistan, some in the Gulf, some in Africa. I mean, how has it been? Has it been really hard for these refugees legal, illegal, to resettle, to have a new life in a different. I know it's a difficult question. I'm sure each story is different, but overall, do you think that the Afghans who suffered so much domestically and then through all these complicated routes managed to escape, have they found a good life or decent life, at least a manageable life in the host countries? I know it varies, I'm sure, but do you have a sense? Do you have is there a way of monitoring any of this, or is it too complicated?
It's too complicated to monitor,
Yeah.
Paul. And as you said, it's very diverse. The stories range from very successful cases to failed examples of integration. But there are many factors that play into it. Being legal versus illegal plays a part in it. For legal refugees, it is much more easier to integrate because there's a process. Yes, arriving here in the US is more difficult. Once you do, the process for integration is there. For illegal migrants, it's more difficult because often they have no connection with the country that they're migrating to. And in my understanding, although need more analysis on this, when I was working in Istanbul on illegal migrants and then working in Abu Dhabi on legal migrants tend to be more educated on average. Mostly people who work the US government speak some English, and these are factors that make it easier for them to integrate. But then it depends country by country as well. In the United States, I think integration is, in my perception, proceeding better compared to the United Kingdom or Germany, because the US is not a welfare state, and here you have to work. And then when you work and you join the workforce, you start integrating automatically. Whereas in many European countries, I've seen clusters of communities where integration is minimal, dependence on the welfare system is high. So it's a very difficult question to answer, Paulo, but the range is there.
Okay, I would like to pause for one moment to see if we've got further questions here from our friends at the table. Yes, good friend, colleague Sean, and who knows Sayer much better than I do because was your student.
I was a student. Yes.
Yes. When we were in Istanbul during those waves of particularly illegal migration into Europe, one of the narratives that was prominent in Eastern Europe, particularly by right-wing politicians, is that these illegal immigrants from Afghanistan were all young men, could be debated at some point in the future to try and overthrow the government or cause havoc in these countries that led to the rise of politicians like Sebastian Kurz and Viktor Orban and in support for their political parties. Do you, in fact, see that in terms of the demographics of percentage? Were there different demographics between legal migration from their perspective, or were the women and the children?
Yeah. Thank you, Doctor. So this is an important distinction here between legal and illegal migrants. I witnessed that illegal migrants tend to be mostly males and of younger age. And for many of them, the objective is for them to reach the country of destination and then start working on a legal process to get their families there. Whereas in legal migration, in the case of refugees, it's usually the whole family that from the outset the case is there. So that I can attest that it's what I witnessed as well. Now, with regards to the right-wing narrative and discourse at the time, yes, I witnessed that as well, and it played a part into it. Although in certain cases, like Viktor Orban, I mean, the Afghan community in Bulgaria is almost non-existent, but it was used for political discourse. But the risk of security for the future is there, because many illegal migrants, young men from not only Afghanistan, Syria, different countries, you cannot do a background check before they arrive. You could do some background check when they arrive, But that is another shortcoming that I have witnessed in the system of the US as well and in other countries, that the background checks more difficult for illegal migrants, but even for legal ones, it's very dependent on signals intelligence, on open source research. And if you have a digital footprint, they can do a background check. But if you really don't have a digital footprint behind you, it's almost impossible to do an effective background check. And an issue with that is that there's a lot of focus on the interview process, but Afghanistan being one of the largest diasporas in the world, the word among Afghans is say as little as you can and you'll get through it. So often in interviews they disclose as little as they can. So this is a risk, doctor. I've written about it recently as well. Our concern is that, as I mentioned earlier, that the Taliban's control on the outer perimeter of the airport and then their ability to issue passports. How many high-risk individuals have traveled? Difficult to say. We recently have reports about the southern border in the US. ISIS-affiliated individuals were able to smuggle people in. So my concern is that there could be security incidents down the road, which will have a negative impact on the general refugee population, unfortunately.
Do we have any questions from our audience online? Well, let's because we're approaching the end of the time allocated to us, but let's try to get a sort of a sense of where are we now? It's been now many years, sadly, after the end of the American and NATO presence, which this could require an entirely different conversation here to try to get a sense of what all that meant. 20 years and then what, and so many casualties left behind.
Yeah.
Is your sense now, obviously you could act in some kind of a peculiar official capacity because you were there as an ambassador, deputy, as a chargé d'affaires, but you no longer had a government, right? In Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, but they allowed you to continue to provide consular services and what have you. I know a similar experience also with some of your colleagues at what used to be the Embassy of Afghanistan here in Washington. But so you did that, and and you helped so many people to go through and find a better life in new countries. Is your sense that the majority of the people who wanted to leave are still there, or how many people didn't make it? I know it's difficult to say, or you estimate they would have really liked to take advantage, or maybe even today are still trying through various means, probably illegal means, and because of the hardships of the Taliban. And also, I mean, frankly, there's again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the economic circumstances, Taliban induced or not, pretty bad. And so many people say, oh, I don't want to be here. What is your sense of Afghanistan now being a place of outward migration to this day? Do you have a sense of networks and flows and people who are still trying their best and succeeding to get out?
Yeah, so the tragic figure that IOM, I believe, released this month was that in a population of roughly 35 million Afghans, 8 million have migrated out of Afghanistan since 2021.
8 million.
8 million.
That's a lot.
Significant number. Now, a lot of them are in Pakistan and Iran and in Turkey to an extent en route out of Afghanistan. So you'll see many of them appearing in Europe at some point because they don't intend to stay in Pakistan. The situation of refugees and Afghan refugees in Pakistan is not as good as it was a few decades back. The same with Iran. We constantly see reports of crackdowns on refugees in Iran. So these millions that are in Pakistan and Iran, they're not going to come back to Afghanistan. They're going to go to Europe.
So that's about 8 million.
That's 8 million is verified now. Now, our understanding is that the line for passports, which the issuance capacity of the Taliban is not able to keep up with demand, is also in 4 to 5 million. So those are traditional individuals that, as soon as they're able to get a passport, would leave Afghanistan.
And the Taliban, it's okay with that? They say, okay, be my guest. You want to go? Please, there's the door, go.
Very confusing, the rhetoric coming from them. I mean, you see them constantly saying that Afghanistan is everyone's home, you need to come back. But in practice, you don't see that. You see retribution, you see disappearances, you see arrests. And then, more openly, you see discrimination. I mean, the largest employer in Afghanistan for decades has been the government, and now the government is exclusively Taliban. So anybody who's not a Talib does not have a right to be employed. So you're in poverty automatically. And then the most important part is Afghan women. Millions of Afghan women were working for government or private sector. They can't work anymore. Many of teachers,
nurses, or something.
Yes. And many of them were the sole breadwinners of their family due to the large death toll of Afghan men in the conflict. Many of them were widows. Some of them were single households. So what option do they have but to leave if they're going to be impoverished there? So I know that the term economic migrants is looked down upon, but in Afghanistan, even that has a tragic side to it. That when there is clear discrimination against
then you are impoverished.
Then you're impoverished, and then you do qualify as a refugee. So the number is very large. But then, based on your earlier question, how many of the allies were left behind by country? That's also a very large number. It's in the tens of thousands at least. The British government admits it.
Do you think, I mean, is there just perfunctory efforts to try to assist those who work, say, for the British forces, for the German forces, for the Italian forces, whoever was there, to still try to intercede with the Taliban and say, please let these people out? Or is this now a moot point that's kind of going nowhere?
No, they're actively seeking even today. This is impressive to me. Yes, I thank the US government and our allies. They still have not forgotten. They're actively engaged. I know that in their meetings, they bring this up often. But there are complexities as well. So, for example, there are even American citizens who are left behind in Afghanistan. Now, they're not left behind because they fell through some list. They're left behind because they have family members who are not American citizens. They cannot leave their mother behind, their father of old age behind, or their wife in some cases. Their children are not American citizens, but they are. So this number is very large. Similarly, green card holders, there are many green card holders whose family members don't have. So they have a process going on of a family reunification, but it's very complicated, especially at the time when they're in Afghanistan. That makes it much more complicated. There's no consular services there. There's no embassy there. So there are a lot of citizens and residents.
As a matter of curiosity, it's kind of a technical issue. Of course, since the US doesn't have an embassy, do we have a kind of a US affairs office in some other embassy that tries to support American efforts in Kabul? Is there any third country that is trying to be liaison between the American government and the Taliban government at this point?
No, it's not a third country. It's a bilateral issue, and it's run by the U.S. mission for Afghanistan that is now based in Doha, Qatar. So there is a charge d'affaires. Her Excellency Karen Decker is in charge of it. Former deputy ambassador to Afghanistan. Now she's in charge of that portfolio. I met her many times on refugee issues when I was in the UAE as well. And there is a Taliban political office still in Doha.
And so they talk.
They talk. It's the Taliban's political office in Doha.
And this American Afghan interests, which is not an embassy, obviously.
It's an embassy outside Afghanistan.
So there are channels.
Yeah.
And is there any, as far as you know, I mean, I know you're not there anymore, and I think now we're almost at the end here. Is there any record of success? I mean, in other words, this efforts played by the American officials trying to plead and get people out, is that going anywhere or?
It's going in the wrong direction, Paulo. It was much more easier to get people out in the first years because of the disarray within the Taliban. You were able to work out a deal with one individual of influence or one faction. But as the Taliban's hierarchy is more established now, and whose hardline elements are firmly in charge now, you now have to convince them, and that is much more harder nowadays.
Mm.
So the efforts are ongoing. I know, I'm aware of it, but the results are becoming more and more difficult to acquire.
I see. Well, I think we're getting now to the end of our. Oh, we do. Great. Then let's. Please do. Well, I can't. I
can read it.
please.
So how have Afghan refugees fared in terms of the resettlements in US, Canada, or elsewhere? Are many able to go back? How is TIA luring people back? I believe TIA is Taliban intelligence.
Interim authority. So this is a very good question, and we touched on it a little bit, but
yes,
it deserves a little bit more of a discussion on this. So the resettlement in the US after arrival here has been, in my personal opinion, much more effective compared to many other countries. The US government has an effective process for integrating refugees, but Afghans came here after 2021 on multiple tracks. So one of the track was the humanitarian parole. That's not going well because there is an Afghanistan Adjustment Act, which is still pending in the Congress and still not passed. And in the absence of that, these parolees would have to leave the United States at some point. And many of them are very.
This is temporary.
It's temporary. It's temporary. So that's not going well. For those who came here in terms of refugee cases like Priority 1 and Priority 2, Priority 1 being UNHCR and US Embassy managed refugees, and Priority 2 being directly US contractors helping their staff or subcontractors out. It's going much better. This is a more effective process. The same for SIV, which is those individuals who work directly with the US mission. And then there are also individuals who came on family sponsorships, family reunifications. So there's a wide range of programs, but to add a bit to the question there, those who came as refugees, P1 and P2, by the legal procedure, they cannot go back to Afghanistan. If they do, they will lose their status as refugees here. So if they go to Afghanistan, it would be for permanent return, and it should be voluntary, which I believe is very rare in this case. Those who came as family sponsorships or other tracks, they are able to travel back to Afghanistan, but I suspect not many of them are. There are some cases, to add to the final point of that question, where TIA has lured people back in from the US and other parts. Some of them are missing. One American citizen actually was lured back, who was a government official in Afghanistan. He was lured back into Afghanistan. To this day, he's one of the 3 Americans that are suspected to be held. And at times they're saying he's a missing individual, and other times he's defined as an incarcerated individual. No proof of life.
Okay.
So
thank you. Please.
There is other several questions. The second question, many Afghans are stuck in Iran where they lack rights. Can anything be done?
Unfortunately, it's very difficult to reach and play a positive role when it comes to Afghan refugees in Iran. There is a crackdown by the authorities there. There is also forced deportation in the hundreds of thousands without any regard for who has a risk to their lives in Afghanistan or not. I'm very hopeless when it comes to Afghan refugees in Iran. Every month the situation is getting worse. And I suspect the only option for them is, as bad as this sounds, is that illegal migration, because there is no other route that I see except return to Afghanistan or going somewhere else.
I think we're time for another question.
The situation of Pakistan's migration issue, and what does the international community need to do in Afghanistan?
Easy question.
Yeah, this is the most difficult, I think. Yes.
Okay.
Well, I mean, to solve the immigration issue, you have to go to the root causes of why are people migrating. The root causes are security issues. Yes, the Taliban did announce a general amnesty, but it has not held up. And we need to have that discussion with the Taliban. international community. We also need to look at the Taliban's approach to inclusivity. They need to include Afghan women, minorities, religious and ethnic, people of different thought into government. Inclusivity doesn't mean the Taliban have this automatic response that inclusivity means bringing former opponents in government with them. That's not what it means. It means involving all of Afghan society, all spheres of life into governance, and then the incentive to migrate is less. And by default, that leads to economic growth, opportunities, and then that's why I mentioned in the beginning, our family was living in the United Kingdom in the 1990s, but we came back to Afghanistan because that is a homeland for us. And in 2001, many Afghans, thousands, tens of thousands, came back from US and Europe. So if we are able to address the root causes of the issue, not only will we not have new migrants, but we'll have a lot of returnees.
Understood. Well, I guess last point, because I think we're running out of time. Is there any leverage, that the West in general can have with the government with the Taliban government? We keep hearing that the country is kind of destitute, there's no money, that it was so dependent on aid coming in from the US and other donors that supported essentially the budget of the government of Afghanistan prior to the fall of the Ghani government. In other words, how does the country under Taliban survives? We know Chinese investments and other things, but what I'm trying to say is there any leverage to say, hey, if you're nice to us, if you do all the things we ask you to do, if you let these people go, well, there's something for you. We can negotiate some type of assistance. Is that kind of leverage exists or no? Because they manage to, whether it's through, continuing the drug smuggling or whatever, or because China invests money in, or other countries, how they manage to do this, and is there any leverage?
The only two leverages that I can identify that the US has in Afghanistan right now is diplomatic non-recognition or conditionalizing recognition on progress in human rights and other issues, and humanitarian aid. Now, the problem is, with regards to diplomatic non-recognition, you could play hardball, and then the US has. But with humanitarian aid, if you play hardball on that, the regular Afghans suffer, the people who need the aid. So it's a bit of a difficult act to manage. But the US, in my opinion, with the very limited leverage that they have, they've played a good role in Afghanistan, but the leverages are limited. With regards to other countries, yes, Chinese, the Russians, there's been a lot of discussions between the Taliban and those governments on investment, on trade, on possible recognition. Both of these countries are in that last step before recognition. But I am also aware that those two countries are not satisfied with the status quo. They understand that in the short run, the Taliban might be someone that they can deal with, but in the long run, many of the risks that they face will be emanating from the Taliban presence in Afghanistan.
Well, anyway, listen, I know this is a very complicated subject, and you yourself are here as somebody who lost his country. And I appreciate, and I think everybody should appreciate the role you played in your various posts, whether it was in Istanbul or in the Emirates, to try to help your countrymen to find a better life. It's a tragedy. Let's not revisit what happened back in 2001 and all the events that triggered the long American and NATO presence. It's very sad that it ended this way and so many people suffered. But that's all the time we have. So on behalf of the Global Policy Institute and Bay Atlantic University, I would like to thank our guest, who has played a very significant role in this tragedy. And we appreciate him sharing his experience and his knowledge and expertise. So thank you, Sayer. Thank you for being with us. And we stand adjourned. Thank you so much.